The late afternoon sun bathed the San Francisco neighborhood in golden light, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Inside the Carter family's home, the aroma of Emma's cooking filled the air, mingling with the gentle hum of the television in the background. James Carter sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and flipping through the newspaper, while their 10-year-old daughter, Lily, lay on the carpet, giggling as she played with their dog, Baxter. Baxter, a striking black and white Border Collie with piercing blue eyes, was known for his sharp instincts and boundless energy. He had been a part of the family for 5 years, ever since James had surprised Lily with him on her 5th birthday. Loyal and intelligent, Baxter had a way of sensing things before anyone else did, an intuition that had saved them from trouble more than once. That evening, however, his behavior changed. At first, it was subtle. Baxter paced near the door, his ears flicking at sounds no one else could hear. He let out a low, uneasy whine, circling the room restlessly. "Baxter, what's wrong, buddy?" James asked, glancing over the top of his newspaper. Lily giggled, tossing Baxter his favorite plush toy. "Come on, boy, play with me." But Baxter didn't play. Instead, he ignored the toy and stood rigid, his gaze fixed on something unseen. He let out a deep, guttural growl, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to explode. Emma, hearing the noise, stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "That's strange. He never growls like that." Baxter suddenly lunged forward, barking ferociously, his body trembling with tension. He darted toward the front door, scratching at it furiously, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor. Then he ran back to Lily, pushing her with his nose, barking again, more desperate this time. James frowned. What's gotten into him? Then it happened. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the ground. It was so soft that no one noticed, except Baxter. His barking escalated to a frenzied pitch, his entire body on edge. He spun in circles, his tail low, his eyes flashing with an intensity that sent a chill down Emma's spine. A moment later, the house groaned. Then, with a deafening roar, the earthquake struck in full force. The floor beneath them buckled. A loud crack split through the walls as picture frames and kitchenware crashed to the ground. Windows shattered, sending shards of glass flying through the air. "Lily! Get down!" James shouted, lunging toward his daughter. Emma screamed as the ceiling fan detached and slammed into the dining table, splintering wood into jagged pieces. The refrigerator lurched forward, toppling onto its side with a metallic crash. Baxter darted toward Lily, barking wildly, as if commanding her to move. "Baxter, stop!" Lily cried, clutching at his fur. Another violent tremor sent them staggering, knocking them to the floor. A massive beam broke loose from the ceiling, crashing down inches from where James had been standing moments before. "We have to get out, now!" Emma screamed over the chaos. James grabbed Lily and pulled her toward the front door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The walls swayed like paper, cracks snaking up from the foundation. But then, a monstrous jolt split the floor beneath them. A section of the house collapsed inward, sending dust and debris flying into the air. Baxter leaped away at the last second, his body disappearing into the cloud of destruction. "Baxter!" Lily shrieked, struggling against her father's grip. James held her tight, shielding her with his body as another section of the house caved in between them and the dog. Through the thick dust and smoke, Baxter's silhouette was gone. The house continued to collapse, and James knew they had no time. Tears streaked Lily's face as they were forced to run, leaving Baxter behind. The world outside was chaos. James, Emma, and Lily stumbled onto the street, coughing as dust and debris filled the air. The once quiet neighborhood was now a scene of devastation, collapsed houses, cracked pavement, and the distant wail of sirens cutting through the eerie silence. The earthquake had lasted only minutes, but its destruction would last for years. "Baxter," Lily whimpered, twisting in her father's grip, her tear-streaked face scanning the remains of their home. "We have to go back. He's still in there." James turned to look at their house, or what was left of it. The roof had caved in, and the entire structure leaned at an impossible angle, groaning under its own weight. Smoke and dust billowed from the wreckage. His heart ached. Baxter was trapped. "We can't," James said, his voice thick with regret. "It's too dangerous." "No," Lily sobbed, struggling. "We can't just leave him." Emma knelt beside her daughter, tears glistening in her own eyes. "Sweetheart, listen to me," she said, holding Lily's face in her hands. "Baxter is smart. He'll find a way out. We have to go somewhere safe." But Lily shook her head furiously. "He was trying to warn us. He knew. And we left him." James swallowed hard, guilt clawing at his chest. He should have listened. Baxter had known something was wrong long before they had felt the first tremor. A loud crack snapped them back to reality. Another section of the house collapsed inward, sending a plume of dust into the air. James grabbed Lily and Emma's hands, pulling them away. "We have to move. Now." With every step, Lily kept looking back, her small frame shaking with silent sobs. James wished he could promise they'd find Baxter. That he was still alive. But in that moment, all he could do was keep his family moving. As they joined the crowd of stunned survivors in the street, the ground trembled again, an aftershock. More buildings crumbled, and people screamed. The city was in ruins, and somewhere beneath that wreckage, Baxter was alone. Baxter awoke to darkness. His ears were ringing, his body aching from the impact of falling debris. The air around him was thick with dust, making every breath feel like inhaling sand. For a moment, he didn't move. He couldn't. His legs felt heavy, his muscles stiff. Then, instincts took over. Baxter tried to stand, but his right hind leg throbbed with pain, likely bruised from the falling wreckage. He let out a soft whimper but quickly silenced himself. He was alone, trapped, and vulnerable. His sharp ears picked up distant noises, sirens wailing, people shouting, the distant hum of helicopters overhead. He needed to get out. He needed to find Lily. With slow, careful movements, Baxter sniffed the air, searching for a way out. The scent of smoke and broken wood filled his nose, but through it, he detected something: fresh air. A way out. Dragging his injured leg behind him, Baxter began to dig. His sharp claws tore through the rubble, paws scraping at the debris above. Dust filled his eyes, but he pressed forward. His family was out there. He had to reach them. After what felt like an eternity, his paws finally broke through, and a thin sliver of moonlight streamed in. With one final push, Baxter forced himself through the opening, collapsing onto the cracked pavement outside. The world had changed. The once familiar street was now a wasteland of destruction. Houses had collapsed, cars were overturned, fires burned in the distance, casting eerie shadows against the night. People wandered through the rubble, some injured, others calling out names of missing loved ones. But Lily's scent was nowhere to be found. Baxter sniffed the air frantically, moving through the debris, ignoring the sharp pain in his leg. He followed the trail of human movement, weaving through fallen beams, broken glass, and abandoned vehicles. The city was unrecognizable. His stomach growled, but hunger didn't matter. His focus was singular: find his family. Hours passed as Baxter wandered the devastated streets. Fatigue set in, but he refused to stop. Then, his ears twitched at the sound of footsteps. A group of stray dogs emerged from an alleyway, 3 of them, large and lean, their fur matted with dirt. Their eyes locked onto Baxter, their posture tense. Baxter froze. He had encountered aggressive strays before, but never under these circumstances. These dogs were starving, desperate, just like everyone else. A low growl rumbled from one of the larger dogs, a muscular pit bull with torn ears and a scar across its muzzle. Baxter lowered his stance, his body tense, but he didn't back down. The pit bull lunged first, aiming for Baxter's injured leg. Baxter dodged just in time, twisting his body to the side. Another dog, a mangy German Shepherd mix, snapped at his flank, teeth barely grazing his fur. Baxter snarled and bit back, his teeth sinking into the attacker's shoulder. The German Shepherd mix yelped, stumbling backward. The pit bull charged again, but before it could reach Baxter, a sharp whistle pierced the air. "Get back!" A man's voice, deep and commanding. Baxter barely had time to react before the dogs scattered, disappearing into the shadows. He turned toward the source of the voice. A tall man in his 60s stood near an overturned truck, a wooden cane in one hand and a flashlight in the other. His face was weathered, his gray beard unkempt. His clothes were worn, layered for warmth. "Didn't think I'd be savant a dog tonight," the man muttered, stepping closer. Baxter watched him warily, his muscles still tense. The man crouched, extending a gloved hand. "Easy, boy. Not gonna hurt ya." Baxter hesitated, then sniffed the air. The man smelled of wood smoke and leather, but there was no fear in his scent. The stranger reached into his coat, pulling out a small piece of jerky. He tossed it onto the ground between them. Baxter was starving. His instincts screamed at him to be cautious, but his stomach won. He limped forward and snatched the food, chewing hungrily. The man smiled. "Figured you were hungry." For the first time that night, Baxter felt something close to safety. The man's name was Tom. A retired firefighter, Tom had survived disasters before. He had seen destruction, saved lives, and lost many more. When the earthquake hit, he had been in his small house on the outskirts of the city. Now, he was alone, scavenging for supplies, unsure if there was anything left to go back to. As he walked, Baxter followed. Not fully trusting, but not wanting to be alone either. "You're not just any stray, are ya?" Tom said as they moved through the ruins. "Somebody's missing you." Baxter's ears perked at the mention of his family. Tom sighed, looking around. "Ain't safe out here. You should stick with me for now." Baxter hesitated. His goal was to find Lily, but his body was weak, wounded. If he didn't recover, he wouldn't make it far. With one last glance at the broken city, he made his decision. He followed Tom into the night. Tom led Baxter to a small, makeshift shelter inside an abandoned warehouse. There were blankets, canned food, and a fire burning in an old metal barrel. Tom poured water into a shallow dish and set it in front of Baxter. "Drink up." Baxter lapped at the water thirstily, his body slowly relaxing. For the first time since the earthquake, he felt warmth, even if just for a little while. But as he curled up on the old blanket, his dreams were filled with Lily's voice. She was out there. And tomorrow, he would continue his journey to find her. Baxter awoke to the sound of distant shouting. His body jerked upright, ears twitching, his instincts immediately on high alert. The small warehouse shelter was still dark, the fire in the barrel now reduced to glowing embers. Tom was awake, standing near the entrance, peering through a gap in the broken metal door. Something was wrong. Baxter sniffed the air. It wasn't just the lingering scent of smoke and dust, there was something else. The distinct, acrid scent of anger, sweat, and something metallic. "Damn looters," Tom muttered under his breath. Baxter crept to his side, peeking outside. In the dim glow of the moonlight, 3 figures moved through the ruins of the street, their flashlights cutting jagged beams through the dust-filled air. They were dressed in ragged layers, their movements sharp and predatory. One of them carried a crowbar, another had a knife tucked into his belt. But the man in the middle, the one leading them, was different. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and a scar running down his cheek. His clothes were a little cleaner than the others, his posture more confident, commanding. Baxter stiffened, his muscles tensing as his eyes locked onto the leader. Tom exhaled slowly. "That's Greg." Baxter felt Tom's body tighten, as if just saying the man's name put him on edge. "Who is he?" Tom muttered to himself. "Some ex-con? Gang leader? No one really knows." But after the earthquake, he started running this part of town like it was his personal kingdom. Baxter growled softly, his fur bristling. Tom placed a calming hand on his back. Easy, boy. Outside, Greg and his men moved closer, their footsteps crunching over broken glass and debris. We clear this area, Greg said, his voice deep and cold. Anything useful, we take. If someone's squatting, they work for us or they leave. His men nodded, spreading out to search the abandoned buildings. Tom backed away from the door, whispering, "We can't stay here. If they find us, they'll take whatever supplies I have, and they'll take you too, buddy." Baxter's ears perked up. Take him? Tom seemed to sense his unease. Greg doesn't just want food and supplies. He wants power. And a dog like you? Smart, strong, and loyal? He'd use you in a second. Baxter let out a low, quiet growl. He had no intention of being anyone's pawn. Tom moved quickly, grabbing his backpack and slinging it over his shoulder. We need to go. Now. Tom and Baxter slipped through the back of the warehouse, moving carefully over the rubble-strewn ground. The city was eerily silent, except for the occasional sound of glass crunching beneath boots as Greg's men searched nearby buildings. Tom moved swiftly despite his limp, his cane barely making a sound as he navigated the broken streets. Baxter stayed close, his body low, his paws barely making a whisper as they moved. They had almost made it to an alleyway when... Crack! A piece of metal clattered onto the ground, echoing like a gunshot in the empty street. Tom froze. Baxter's ears snapped up, his body instantly alert. What was that? One of Greg's men called. Over there, by the alley, another voice shouted. Find them. Tom muttered a curse under his breath. Run. Baxter didn't need to be told twice. He bolted. Tom was slower, his injured leg preventing him from keeping up. Baxter turned, looking back, his instincts screaming to stay with him. But then, Greg stepped into view. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Greg's mouth curled into a cold smile. Now that's a fine dog. Baxter snarled, his teeth bared. Greg's men started closing in. Don't let it get away, Greg ordered. I want that dog. Baxter had seconds to react. He turned and lunged, not toward Greg, but toward a pile of stacked debris to the side. Using all his strength, he leaped, his paws catching the ledge just as hands reached out to grab him. He scrambled up and over, landing on the other side with a painful thud. Damn it! Greg's voice echoed behind him. Go after him. But Baxter was already gone, slipping through the darkened streets like a shadow. Baxter ran for blocks, his heart pounding. He needed to find Tom. Then, pain. Something snapped around his neck, yanking him backward. A thick rope tightened around his throat, cutting off his breath. Baxter thrashed, but the more he struggled, the tighter it became. Laughter echoed in the night. Well, a voice sneered. Looks like Greg gets his dog after all. When Baxter came to, he was in a small, dimly lit room, the scent of oil and sweat thick in the air. His legs were bound, and Greg was standing in front of him, arms crossed. You're a damn fine animal, Greg said. Smart. Fast. I could use a dog like you. Baxter stared at him, unflinching. You help me, Greg continued. You work for me, and I'll make sure you're fed, kept warm. You'll be part of my crew. Baxter didn't move. Greg sighed, shaking his head. You don't get it, do you? Out there, you're nothing. Stray dogs don't last long in a city like this. But with me, you'll have power. Baxter growled low, his body tense. Greg chuckled. Still got fight in you, huh? That's good. I like a challenge. He turned to one of his men. Put him in the yard with the others. We'll see if he learns his place. As Greg's men dragged Baxter away, he dug his claws into the ground, resisting. He wasn't giving up. Somewhere out there, Lily was still waiting for him. And nothing, not Greg, Not his men, not this ruined city, was going to stop him from finding her. Baxter lay still in the makeshift pen, his body tense but his mind focused. Greg's men had thrown him into an abandoned construction site, fencing it off with rusted metal panels. 3 other dogs were inside, 2 thin strays and a burly Rottweiler with a heavy chain around its neck. The strays huddled in the corner, their eyes dull, defeated. The Rottweiler, however, sat upright, watching Baxter with a steady, intelligent gaze. Baxter had no intention of staying. His body still ached from the earthquake, but he pushed the pain aside. He had survived worse. He needed to get out. Lily was still waiting for him. The moonlight filtered through a gap in the fence. Baxter scanned the enclosure, looking for a weakness. The fence was high, but near the far corner, a section had loosened from its frame. If he could break through. The Rottweiler spoke first. "Escape's impossible." His voice was deep, measured. Baxter turned his head slightly, acknowledging him. The others tried, the Rottweiler continued, motioning toward the strays. "Greg doesn't let anyone leave." Baxter didn't respond. He walked toward the weak spot and pressed his weight against the metal panel. It groaned but held firm. One of the strays lifted his head. "No point trying." Baxter ignored him. He pushed again. Harder. The metal creaked, shifting slightly. The Rottweiler narrowed his eyes. "You're not like the others." Baxter paused, turning to face him. "What's out there for you?" the Rottweiler asked. "A little girl with golden hair. A home. A family." Baxter snorted softly, then turned back to the fence and lunged with all his strength. The panel snapped free, the force sending Baxter tumbling forward. Open space. Freedom. The Rottweiler hesitated only a second before charging through the gap behind him. "Hey! The dogs!" A voice shouted from behind. Flashlights cut through the darkness, heavy boots pounded against the dirt. They had seconds. Baxter took off into the ruins of the city, the Rottweiler close behind. The wind rushed past them as they dodged through the wreckage, leaping over broken concrete and weaving between abandoned cars. Greg's men were fast, but Baxter was faster. They reached the edge of the collapsed highway. The Rottweiler skidded to a stop. No way across. Baxter didn't hesitate. He backed up, gauging the distance, then sprinted forward and leapt. For a heart-stopping moment, he was airborne, his paws barely catching the crumbling edge of the other side. The Rottweiler hesitated. "Jump!" Baxter barked. With a deep breath, the Rottweiler followed, clearing the gap just as Greg's men reached the edge. Too late. They were free. Baxter turned toward the city. Toward home. Baxter and the Rottweiler ran until their muscles burned, their breaths heavy in the cold night air. The city around them was eerily quiet, the destruction from the earthquake leaving everything in a state of ruin and abandonment. They finally slowed near an old residential street, its houses standing half-collapsed, covered in dust and debris. Baxter's nose twitched, he caught the faintest trace of Lily's scent, distant but real. Home was close. But his body was weak, his limbs sore from exhaustion. The Rottweiler panted beside him. "We need rest," the Rottweiler murmured. Baxter didn't want to stop, but he knew they wouldn't make it much farther without strength. Then, a sound, a door creaking open. Baxter's ears perked. An elderly woman, bundled in a thick coat, stood in the doorway of a small, intact house. Her sharp eyes took in their battered bodies, the wounds, the exhaustion. She stepped forward slowly, her cane tapping softly against the ground. "You two look like you've been through hell," she said, her voice rough but kind. Baxter held still, watching her carefully. The Rottweiler gave a low growl, wary. The woman simply chuckled. "I've seen a lot in my life, but I ain't never turned away a soul in need. Come inside, if you want. Got some food and water." Baxter hesitated, but his instincts told him this woman was different. Cautiously, he stepped forward. Inside, The house was modest but warm, a fire burning in the old stone fireplace. A bowl of water and some leftover meat sat on the floor, as if she had already known they would come. "Eat," she said simply. Baxter lowered his head and drank deeply, the cool water refreshing his parched throat. The Rottweiler soon followed, chewing hungrily on the meat. The woman sat in an old wooden chair, watching them closely. "Where you boys headed?" Baxter lifted his head. She smiled knowingly. "Ah. You're going home, aren't you?" Baxter's tail thumped softly against the floor. She exhaled, then pointed toward the door. "It's not far, but it won't be easy. Aftershocks knocked down most of the roads. And I heard there's flooding near the neighborhoods." Baxter stood, his body still aching but his determination unwavering. The woman nodded, respect in her eyes. "I see it now. You're one of the special ones, the kind that don't give up." She opened the door. "Go, then. And don't stop for anything." Baxter stepped into the night, his heart pounding. The final stretch home had begun. Baxter ran through the broken city, his paws kicking up dust and debris as he neared his old neighborhood. The scent of home was stronger now, cutting through the lingering smell of smoke and destruction. His muscles burned, his injured leg throbbed, but none of it mattered. Lily was close. The Rottweiler kept pace beside him but suddenly slowed. "This is where we part ways," he rumbled, his deep eyes filled with understanding. Baxter stopped, panting, and looked at him. "You got someone waiting for you," the Rottweiler said. "Go to her." Baxter hesitated, then pressed his nose against the Rottweiler's in a silent farewell before turning and sprinting toward home. The Carter family's house had been reduced to rubble. Lily stood among the ruins, her small frame wrapped in a thin coat, her face pale and streaked with dirt. She clutched a stuffed animal tightly, Baxter's old toy. James and Emma stood nearby, sorting through the wreckage. But Lily wasn't looking at the ruins. She was staring at the street, her eyes scanning, searching. She had never stopped waiting. "Baxter," she whispered. Then, a shadow appeared in the distance. A black and white figure, moving unsteadily but determinedly toward her. Lily's breath caught. Her grip on the toy loosened. Then, she screamed. "Baxter!" James and Emma whirled around just in time to see Baxter burst into a full sprint, his body still battered, his fur matted with dust and blood. Lily ran. Tears streaming, arms outstretched. Baxter lunged forward, collapsing into her embrace. She sobbed into his fur, her tiny hands gripping his coat as if afraid he would disappear. "I knew you'd come back," she whispered. "I knew it." Baxter licked her face, his tail thumping weakly. James and Emma rushed forward, kneeling beside them. Emma covered her mouth, her eyes glistening. "Oh my God." James, usually the strong one, blinked away tears as he ran his hands through Baxter's fur. "You found your way home, boy." His voice cracked. "You really did." Baxter let out a soft whimper, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. But he didn't need to fight anymore. He was home. Baxter lay on a makeshift bed of blankets, his breathing steady but weak. The Carter family had set up shelter in a temporary relief center, a large gymnasium repurposed for earthquake survivors. Families huddled together on cots, volunteers handed out food and water, and emergency workers worked tirelessly to provide aid. But none of that mattered to Baxter. Because he was with Lily again. She sat beside him, her small hand stroking his fur gently, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. "Is he going to be okay?" Lily asked, her voice small. Emma knelt beside her, brushing a hand over Baxter's coat. "He's been through a lot, sweetheart. But he's a fighter." James crouched down, rubbing Baxter's head. "We'll get him checked by the vet first thing tomorrow. For now, he just needs rest." Baxter tilted his head up, gazing at the people he loved most. He could feel the warmth of their touch, the familiar scent of home on their clothes, even in the midst of destruction. Lily curled up beside him, resting her head against his body. For the first time in days, Baxter closed his eyes, not from exhaustion, but from peace. He was safe. The days that followed were filled with recovery and rebuilding. The Carter family, like many others, had lost their home, but they had not lost each other. With the help of volunteers, James and Emma began making plans to rebuild. Baxter's injuries healed slowly, thanks to the care of a kind vet who had set up a temporary clinic in the shelter. The bruises faded, the cuts mended, and the exhaustion that once weighed on him finally lifted. One morning, as the sun rose over the battered city, Lily and Baxter stood together outside the shelter. The world had changed, but some things never would. "You know what, Baxter?" Lily whispered, leaning in close. "You're my hero." Baxter licked her cheek, his tail wagging for the first time in days. She giggled, wiping her face. "You came back for me. Just like you promised." James and Emma stood nearby, watching their daughter with quiet smiles. "He's more than just a dog," Emma murmured. "He's family." James nodded. "And we're going to start over, together." Months later, after the dust had settled and rebuilding had begun, the Carter family moved into a new home. It wasn't grand or perfect, but it was theirs. And in the backyard, stretched out in the soft grass, lay Baxter, watching over Lily as she played. He had traveled through fire, through danger, through fear, but he had made it back. Because no matter the distance, no matter the obstacles, home is where the heart is. And Baxter had finally found his way home.